The war room hummed with tension, thick enough to cut with a vibroblade. 17 different species crowded around the central hollow table, each delegation speaking in overlapping tongues that the translation algorithms struggled to parse in real time. Admiral Thrick's mandibles clicked impatiently as he waited for the system to catch up the delay, causing another round of misinterpretations that sent the Valdorian representative into a fit of screeching. In the back corner, behind a support pillar that most people forgot existed, Ava Marin hunched over her tiny translation workstation. Her fingers danced across the holographic interface as she manually corrected what the automated systems had mangled beyond recognition. It was the third year of the war against the Hegemony Empire, and the Alliance's outdated translation protocols were failing them more each day. Stupid machine," she muttered under her breath as she fixed yet another linguistic disaster. The system had just translated the Zorathi ambassador's carefully worded proposal for joint tactical maneuvers as a suggestion for a group mating ritual. Again, nobody paid attention to her corrections. They never did. She was just the translator, Level 3 human subdivision, relegated to cleaning up the messes that more sophisticated systems couldn't handle. The irony wasn't lost on her that in a war where communication was everything, the people doing the actual communicating were treated like glorified janitors. The meeting droned on for another 2 hours, with Ava faithfully translating increasingly heated exchanges between species who seemed more interested in scoring political points than winning the war. When it finally ended, she gathered her things and prepared to return to her cubicle in Sub-Level 7, where she'd spend the rest of her shift processing routine intelligence reports. That's when she saw it. Buried in the latest batch of intercepted hegemony communications was something that made her blood run cold. Not the content, she'd seen enough propaganda to fill a small library by now, but the structure. Hidden within the standard imperial rhetoric were symbols that didn't match any language in her extensive database. They weren't random errors or transmission artifacts. They formed patterns. Complex, deliberate patterns that seemed to follow rules that shouldn't exist. Ava stared at the screen for a long moment, her heart pounding. This was exactly the kind of discovery that could get her in serious trouble. The standing orders were clear. Translate what you're given, file your reports, and don't waste time on academic curiosities. But she couldn't shake the feeling that these symbols meant something crucial. Against her better judgment, she saved the files to her personal partition. She'd look at them later, after hours, when nobody would notice. The next morning brought a mountain of rushed translation requests marked Urgent, Priority Alpha. More propaganda broadcasts, tactical assessments, and the usual litany of hegemony threats. Ava worked through them mechanically, but her mind kept drifting to those strange symbols. She'd spent half the night staring at them, trying to make sense of their structure. During her lunch break, she made a decision that would change everything. Instead of eating in the cafeteria like usual, she took the lift to Sub-Level 12 to the Archaeological Archive, maintained by Dr. Shin. If anyone could help her understand what she'd found, it would be him. Dr. Shin was a brilliant Terran scientist who specialized in pre-colonization artifacts. His office was a cluttered maze of relics, star charts, and towering stacks of research papers. When Ava knocked on his door, he looked up from a particularly intricate piece of machinery with the enthusiasm of someone who hadn't had a visitor in months. "Ava, what brings you to my dusty corner of the universe?" She hesitated, suddenly aware of how crazy this might sound. "Doctor, I need your opinion on something. I found some symbols in a hegemony transmission that don't match any known language. I was wondering if you might have seen anything similar in your historical research." Dr. Shin's eyebrows rose. "Show me." Ava pulled up the symbols on her portable display. Dr. Shin studied them for a long moment, his expression growing increasingly serious. Then he rushed to one of his storage units and pulled out a crystalline artifact covered in protective fields. "My God," he whispered. "These are predecessor symbols. The Cygnus civilization wrote in patterns like this over 10,000 years ago." Ava felt the floor drop away beneath her. The predecessors were a myth, a legend from the early days of space exploration. Ancient beings who supposedly possessed technology so advanced it seemed like magic to the species that came after. Most serious scientists dismissed them as folklore. "That's impossible," she said. "The predecessors never existed. They're just stories made up by—" "I thought so too," Dr. Shin interrupted, "until I found this." He gestured to the crystal artifact. It's genuine Cygnus technology recovered from a dead world in the Outer Rim, and the symbols on it are nearly identical to what you've shown me. They spent the next several hours comparing the intercepted hegemony symbols with the markings on the Cygnus crystal. The similarities were undeniable, but more disturbing was what they seemed to represent not just a language, but a form of mathematical logic that predated binary systems. It was as if the hegemony had somehow reverse-engineered predecessor technology. "If I'm right," Dr. Shin said quietly, "they're not just using old symbols for show. They're actually implementing predecessor logic systems. That could explain why their defensive shields have become so much more effective recently." Ava felt a chill run down her spine. "We have to tell someone." "Who? The War Council? They'll laugh us out of the room. A level 3 translator and a basement archaeologist claiming the hegemony is using mythical technology." But Ava was already formulating a plan. What if we could prove it? What if we could show them how this language works? Maybe even use it ourselves. Dr. Shin looked at her as if she'd suggested wrestling a star. "Ava, the mathematical principles behind predecessor technology are beyond our current understanding. We're talking about logical paradoxes that can apparently have physical effects on reality. It's not just translation, it's applied metaphysics." "Then we learn," Ava said firmly. "We figure it out." What followed were weeks of the most intense work of Ava's life. By day, she maintained her normal duties, churning through translation assignments with mechanical efficiency. By night, she and Dr. Shin worked in secret mapping the structure of what they'd started calling the paradox language. It was unlike anything in Ava's experience. Where most languages relied on linear logic, if A then B, the predecessor system seemed to embrace contradictions. It could simultaneously express opposing concepts in the same construct, creating what Dr. Shin called logical loopbacks that somehow enhanced computational efficiency. "Look at this pattern," Dr. Shin said one night, pointing to a complex symbol cluster they'd decoded. "It's expressing defensive strength through deliberate vulnerability. In normal logic, that's nonsense. But in this system, the contradiction becomes a source of power." Ava studied the symbols until her eyes burned. Slowly, an understanding began to form. It's not about creating contradictions, she realized. It's about finding the spaces between opposing truths and using the tension to generate something. Energy, information, I'm not sure. Their breakthrough came during the 7th week of research. Ava was analyzing a particularly complex hegemony transmission when she noticed something that made her nearly fall out of her chair. The symbols weren't just decorative, they were functional. Embedded within the communication were actual computational instructions, written in predecessor logic. "Dr. Shin," she called, her voice shaking, "I think I know how they're using this language. It's not just in their computers, it's in their shield generators." Within hours, they'd confirmed her theory. The hegemony had somehow integrated predecessor logical paradoxes into their defensive systems. Their shields didn't just absorb energy, they created localized reality distortions that made attacks less effective. No wonder the Alliance's conventional weapons had been failing. Ava knew she had to take this to the War Council despite the risks. If she was wrong, her career was over. If she was right and did nothing, the war might be lost. The next morning, she requested an emergency meeting with Admiral Thrick. His aide, a bored-looking Kaldorian subcommander, looked at her as if she'd asked to redecorate the bridge with finger paints. "Level 3 translators don't get emergency meetings with the Admiral," he said dismissively. "File a report like everyone else." "This is about winning the war," Ava insisted. "I've discovered how the hegemony shields work. We can beat them." Something in her tone must have convinced him because 20 minutes later, she found herself standing in Admiral Thrick's office, Dr. Shin beside her, both of them feeling wildly out of place. Admiral Thrick was a tall, imposing Keldorian with the kind of military bearing that made junior officers stand straighter in his presence. He listened to Ava's explanation with increasing skepticism, his mandibles clicking impatiently. "Let me understand this correctly," he said when she finished. "You believe the hegemony is using a mythical language from a civilization that may never have existed to enhance their shields through applied paradoxes." "It sounds crazy when you put it like that," Ava admitted. "But yes, and I think I know how to create a counter-frequency that could disrupt their systems." Admiral Thrick studied the data she'd compiled, his expression unreadable. "The Council has been looking for an advantage for months. Our traditional tactics aren't working. But this is highly speculative." "Give me one ship," Ava said, surprising herself with her boldness. "One chance to prove this works. If I'm wrong, court-martial me. If I'm right, we might have found the key to winning this war." There was a long silence. Finally, Admiral Thrick nodded slowly. "Very well. We have a skirmish planned near Outpost Zeta 9 next week. The hegemony has been testing their new shield configurations there. I'll allow you to implement your paradox weapon on one vessel. If it works, we'll discuss broader implementation. If it fails, we'll discuss your future in waste management." Despite the threat, Ava felt a surge of excitement. They were actually going to try it. The next week passed in a blur of preparation. Ava worked with the weapons engineers to modify the pulse cannons of the battleship Indomitable Resolve, programming them to emit the specific frequency patterns she'd derived from her study of predecessor logic. It was a rush job, and she wasn't entirely sure the modifications would work. The day of the battle, Ava stood on the bridge of the Indomitable Resolve, watching the tactical display as hegemony ships moved into position near Outpost Zeta 9. Admiral Thrick had grudgingly allowed her to observe, though he made it clear she was there on sufferance. "Enemy vessels approaching optimal range," the weapons officer reported. "Shields are showing standard configuration weight. Sir, they're deploying something new. The energy signatures are unlike anything in our database." Admiral Thrick's mandibles clicked nervously. "Perfect. They choose today to test new defenses. Translator, I hope you know what you're doing." Ava stared at the tactical display, her mouth dry. The lead hegemony vessel was a massive dreadnought, its shields shimmering with an energy pattern she recognized from her research. It was definitely using predecessor logic enhancement. "Fire conventional weapons first," she suggested. "Let's confirm the shields are using the paradox enhancement." The Indomitable Resolve unleashed a barrage of plasma cannons. The bolts struck the hegemony shields and simply faded away, absorbed by the reality distortions the predecessor logic created. "Conventional weapons ineffective," the weapons officer confirmed. "Enemy shields are holding at 100% efficiency." Admiral Thrick turned to Ava. "Your stage translator." This was it. Months of work, weeks of preparation, all coming down to this moment. Ava took a deep breath and activated the modified weapon systems. "Firing paradox pulse," she announced, her finger hovering over the trigger. The weapon fired, and for a moment nothing seemed to happen. Then reality hiccuped. The energy beam that emerged from the Indomitable Resolve wasn't like anything they'd seen before. It twisted through space in impossible spirals, carrying with it the contradictory logic of the predecessor language. When it struck the hegemony dreadnought's shields, something extraordinary happened. The shields didn't break or overload, they contradicted themselves out of existence. The predecessor logic that had been strengthening them became their weakness when confronted with an even more complex logical paradox. The shields collapsed in a cascade of spatial distortions that rippled across the enemy formation. "Direct hit," the tactical officer shouted. "Enemy shields are completely down." But Ava wasn't done. She'd programmed the weapon to fire multiple paradox pulses, each one building on the last. The second pulse punched through the dreadnought's hull like it was paper. The third disabled 6 more hegemony vessels as the cascade effect spread through their formation. Within minutes, the entire enemy fleet was retreating their once invincible shields, useless against weapons that spoke the same language they did, but with a better understanding of grammar. The bridge erupted in cheers. Admiral Thrick stared at the tactical display in amazement, then slowly turned to Ava. "I owe you an apology, Translator, and the Alliance owes you a debt that can never be fully repaid." Word of the victory spread quickly through the Alliance fleet. Within hours, Ava found herself summoned before the full War Council, not as a lowly translator, but as the woman who discovered the key to victory. The council chamber was packed with representatives from all 17 Alliance species, each eager to hear how a Level 3 human translator had achieved what their best military minds could not. Admiral Thrick presented Ava to the assembly with something approaching reverence. "Distinguished colleagues," he began, "I present Translator Ava Marin, who has discovered a method to neutralize hegemony shield technology using principles derived from ancient predecessor logic systems." The reaction was immediate and explosive. Questions flew from all directions, each species talking over the others in their excitement. How had she done it? Could the technology be replicated? What did this mean for the war effort? Ava stood in the center of it all, no longer the forgotten translator hidden behind a pillar. When the noise finally died down, she spoke with a confidence she'd never felt before. "What I discovered," she said, "is that the hegemony has been using incomplete predecessor technology. They understood the symbols, but not the deeper logic behind them. By creating weapons that speak the same language, but with perfect grammar, we can turn their greatest strength against them." The questions continued for hours. Technical specifications, implementation timelines, resource requirements. Suddenly, everyone wanted to know what the humble translator thought. By the end of the day, the War Council had made several critical decisions. First, Ava was immediately promoted to head of predecessor linguistic research, with a team of scientists and linguists to assist her. Second, the Alliance would begin immediate production of paradox-enhanced weapons based on her discoveries. Third, and perhaps most importantly, every intercepted communication would be analyzed for additional predecessor elements. "The war isn't over," Admiral Thrick reminded the Council as the meeting concluded. "But for the first time in 3 years, we have real hope of victory." In the weeks that followed, Ava's life changed completely. Gone was the tiny workstation behind the pillar, replaced by a sprawling research facility on Level 2. Her team of 12 brilliant linguists and xenoarchaeologists worked around the clock to decode more predecessor secrets. But perhaps the most satisfying change was the respect she now received. The same officers who had once ignored her urgent corrections now sought her input on critical decisions. The translation errors that had plagued the Alliance for years became a thing of the past, as Ava's team refined their understanding of both contemporary and ancient languages. "You know," Dr. Shin said one evening, as they reviewed the latest batch of decoded predecessor texts, "this is just the beginning. We've barely scratched the surface of what this language can do." He was right. Every day brought new discoveries. The predecessors hadn't just developed advanced technology, they'd created a way of thinking that could literally reshape reality through the proper application of logical paradoxes. And now, for the first time in millennia, someone was learning to speak their language fluently. As Ava stood in her new office, looking out through the massive viewport at the stars beyond, she felt a profound sense of purpose. The galaxy was vast, filled with mysteries that had waited eons for someone curious enough to seek them out. And somewhere out there in the space between contradictions lay the secrets of creation itself. The war against the hegemony continued, but its outcome was no longer in doubt. Armed with weapons that spoke the language of the universe's architects, the Alliance pushed forward, reclaiming system after system. Each victory brought new predecessor artifacts, new insights into the nature of reality itself. But for Ava, the greatest victory was personal. She'd proven that knowledge and curiosity could triumph over prejudice and bureaucracy. That sometimes the most important discoveries came from the most unexpected places. That even the person in the corner dismissed as just a translator might hold the key to everything. The last entry in her research log, made 6 months after the Battle of Zeta 9, read simply, "Today, we spoke to the stars themselves. Tomorrow, we learned to listen to what they say back." The universe, it seemed, had been waiting for someone who understood that the most powerful truths often lived in the spaces between opposites. And Ava Marin, once overlooked and underestimated, had become the bridge between what was and what could be, a translator, not just of languages, but of possibilities themselves. In the end, they never called her just the translator again.